energy due to the fact that the nuclear power plants were state-owned. In Germany, on the other hand, they are possessed by big companies. 4. Looking back, in France, Chernobyl stands for disinformation and for betrayal by the government of their own people, when nuclear experts spread the opinion that there was no reason to worry about questions of public health, as the level of radioactivity would remain too low to cause concern and did not cross the border. In Germany, construction of nuclear power plants was accompanied by protests from the very beginning. These protests accumulated in the early 70s when the building of a plant near Freiburg and near the French border was successfully prevented. The little town of Wiel became a symbol of civil resistance. Local Catholic and Protestant churches played an important role. This was one of the roots of the Green movement in Germany. In 1986, the Greens were already in local parliaments. They demanded Geiger counters for detecting radiation in playgrounds, schoolyards, football fields, and sandboxes. They supported parents' demands to reduce outdoor activities for children. The distance between Chernobyl and Germany is about 2,000 kilometers, which equals 1,500 miles. Is that about correct? But the radioactive plume covered the entire Germany. Families with small children left for Spain, fresh vegetables and milk were disposed, and farmers received some financial compensation. One genetic effect was to be seen in January 1987 in Munich and Berlin, 9 months after the catastrophe, when 2 to 3 times more Down syndromes in children were diagnosed. Belarus statistics resemble the same. We suspect the same for Japan, but as far as I know, data are not available. The explosion hurled radioactive substances 7 kilometers into the atmosphere. They circled around the northern hemisphere. The winds blew from southeast to northwest. Therefore, the plume was first detected in Sweden. Until today, the Laplanders strive for survival because their reindeer die and the meat is contaminated. Every year in Germany, over 3,000 hunters in Bavaria ask for financial compensation because of game measuring over 600 becquerel per kilo, which they are not allowed to sell. Half of the samples controlled are considered radioactive waste. When the wind changed and the plume was on its way to Moscow in the early May days, it was artificially drained in early May, which added to the contaminated areas after the explosion. Cynical decision makers had not warned the people who complained about headache, nausea, vomiting, hair loss, coughing, skin rash, and a sore throat. Nobody ever estimated the radiation which they had received, and nobody told them not to eat the products from their gardens. Only months later did they realize that the yellowish rain had something to do with Chernobyl. The area is the district of Mogilov. The area next to Chernobyl is the Gomel area. It is estimated that fallout equivalent to 17 Hiroshima bombs spread out over Belarus. 70% of the reactor contents. 1/4, 25% of the territory is contaminated. 2.5 million of the 10 million inhabitants are affected. The areas were divided into 3 zones. Up to 5 Curie per square kilometer, no measures were taken. Between 5 to 15, financial help. They called it coffin money. Recreation once a year for children, free medical treatment, decontamination of the schoolyards. over 15 Curie, relocation of the people, warning signs, no-go area, no agriculture. It is called the zone. There, the number of species is reduced to 1/3, and mammals and birds show changes in the outward appearance and chromosomal aberrations. The 20th anniversary in 2006 marked a change in the political perception. Monuments were erected to commemorate the evacuated villages, and within the school museums, a Chernobyl corner was set up. President Lukashenko, he is called the last dictator of Europe, made the catastrophe become history. And the former privileges of people living in the zones were stopped. In Belarus, Chernobyl is a major tragedy of the 20th century and is considered equivalent to World War II, where 1/4 of the population, again 2.5 million people, lost their lives. Previous to the accident, no public discussion of the invisible pollution, of low radiation risk, or of questions of waste had taken place. The Soviet propaganda of atoms for peace and clean energy production prevailed. The 30-kilometer zone around Chernobyl, which is in the Ukraine, was evacuated after a few days, but people had already absorbed high doses of radiation. One isotope which is particularly dangerous, iodine, you know that, its half-life being 8 days. It is a gas, and it can fly hundreds of kilometers. Once inhaled or incorporated with food, it is hazardous for the thyroid gland, which needs it to produce growth hormones. After Chernobyl, the most prominently and quite quick observed type of malignancy was thyroid cancer. It is estimated that within the first decade, 4,000 to 5,000 children suffered from it. Nowadays, the incidence in children is still higher before 1986, probably due to cesium-137, and today various thyroid diseases, 30 years after Chernobyl, including cancer in grown-ups, are observed. This thyroid cancer is the only disease which the World Health Organization recognized as Chernobyl-related. Everything else has nothing to do with it. About 80% of the fallout consists of cesium. It is absorbed like potassium, and you find it in every tissue, its half-life being 29 years, thus remaining within the biological chain for nearly 300 years, times 10, half-life times 10, and then you have it. The radiation, the gamma radiation, which it emits, can be compared to X-rays. You can trace it in all organs, vascular walls, brain, and through the umbilical vein it enters the embryo. The development of the embryo nowadays can be disturbed, which lead in the early pregnancy weeks to abortion. Moreover, small fœtate babies and premature babies are born nowadays. Intrauterine disturbances of the brain develop they result in a diffuse lack, teachers tell us, of attentiveness in children. Of course, it can have other reasons too, but they say before Chernobyl it was different. The increasing incidence of sugar diabetes in young children is officially acknowledged as a consequence of Chernobyl and might result from an intrauterine damage of the pancreas. Low radiation causes aging of the vascular wall cells, which results in what is called in Belarus and Ukraine, sudden death syndrome. Strokes and heart infections occur 15 to 20 years earlier than in our Western population. Children are extremely susceptible to radiations. Since their life expectancy is higher, they will experience the latency of malignant diseases. Another radionuclide I want to mention is strontium-90. The organism mistakes it for calcium. Therefore, the highest concentration is found in bones and teeth. Its half-life is 29 years. It emits beta radiation into the bone marrow, thus damaging the hemopoietic system. It is responsible for malignant blood diseases such as leukemia, sarcomas, and lymphomas. The immune system is weakened, which results in what is called Chernobyl AIDS. Many children complain nowadays about nose bleeding, chronic infections of the bronchial system, fast exhaustion, and various disorders of the central nervous system. Since 1991, we invite children from a contaminated county in the east of Belarus during the summer. Always they undergo thorough dental treatment. Year by year, the number of decayed teeth seems to be increasing. Last year, when we visited the most contaminated Gomel district, we were told that the concentration in strontium-90 in potatoes and grain remained the same as in 1990. Because of its half-life, you would have expected half the concentration. One explanation of this could be that strontium-90, which is heavier than cesium, was more concentrated in the closer neighborhood to Chernobyl. The other explanation that these crops have a high affinity to strontium. These findings should lead to consequent ongoing control to reduce incorporation of radioactive food, but of course the people say it's long ago, we don't do it anymore. Before ending, I would like to pay some attention to the liquidators who saved the Northern Hemisphere from an even greater catastrophe and risked their lives. Around 800,000 young men, mostly soldiers from all over the Soviet Union, were recruited. With little or mostly none protection, they worked until October 1986 to build the so-called sarcophagus around the reactor. They were called heroes, but suffered a terrible fate. Local firemen died after a few days or weeks in a Moscow hospital of acute radiation diseases, since they had received a dose of 10 sievert or even more, trying to extinguish the graphite fire on the roof. During the following 6 months, the radioactive intake of the workers was improperly measured, if at all. The soldiers themselves had no understanding about radioactivity and were told to drink vodka against their symptoms. Accurate figures about their health cannot be obtained since they came from all over the huge Soviet Union. However, we know about the 140,000 Belarusian liquidators who were registered centralized and had an annual free follow-up check until 2006. In 2014, we were told last year that only 60,000 of these 140,000 are still treated in now local medical centers. From Ukrainian liquidators, we know that their mortality rate is 5 times higher compared to the male population. In 2002, the Ministry of Health declared that the incidence of ill liquidators increased from 20% in 1987 to 92% in 2002. Afterwards, we don't know. Plausible medical follow-up studies for liquidators or for the population do not exist or cover up. the head nurse in this county, Kostukovici, which I have visited 50 or more times throughout the years, where the children come from, told me that mortality statistics are canned and that they are paid bonuses if they have good diagnosis. People die on accidents, alcohol, tuberculosis, infections, or even the diagnosis old age over 65 is accepted, but not Chernobyl. It's not said that there is any Chernobyl sequelae or consequence, I don't know what you call it. The social and health impact on Chernobyl is ongoing, and let me conclude with a quotation of one of my Belarusian friends. We do not live after Chernobyl, we live with Chernobyl. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. SIEDENTOPF. I now call ARNIE GUNDERSEN. He's a well-known international expert on nuclear safety, an ex-executive from the nuclear industry with a lot of experience, and he's also with this organization, Fairewinds Energy Education, which does a great job in demystifying nuclear energy. So he will talk about 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Okay, Arnie Gundersen, I'm with Fairewinds, and if you're spelling Gundersen, it has an E, and Fairewinds has an E. That way you can remember them. What I studied TMI extensively. I was one of a lesser degree, but still significantly, I've studied Chernobyl from an operations standpoint, and I've come to the conclusion that if we, as a civilization, had learned the lessons of Fukushima, had learned the lessons of TMI and Chernobyl, Fukushima never would have happened. The first lesson that was totally ignored was that as engineers, we need to expect the unexpected. Every one of these events happened outside of what experts thought was the worst possible scenario. So the bottom line is that nuclear is a technology that does that routinely. You know, that you study all the reasons a power plant can fail, and you think you got them all, and there's always one you haven't analyzed, which is this: expect the unexpected. Now, this is from the Diet Commission on Fukushima, but I submit to you that if we replaced Fukushima with Chernobyl, or if we replaced the word TMI in Fukushima, this statement would apply to both. The accident in Fukushima Daiichi cannot be regarded as a natural disaster. It was a profoundly man-made disaster that could have been and should have been foreseen and prevented. That's not Fukushima specific. That's also Chernobyl and TMI. The Diet Commission, the Diet is the equivalent of a parliament in Japan, and they commissioned a study to look at the accident. So I come up with four areas of the lessons we should have learned from TMI and Chernobyl, and had we learned those, we might have been able to avoid Fukushima. The first is that safety systems that engineers design will fail. The second is that emergency planning will fail. The third is that people will die. There's no doubt in my mind that people died at 3 Mile Island. I'll talk about that. And then separately, obviously, we have deaths at Chernobyl, regardless of what the IAEA and the nuclear establishment will tell you. And the last is that the risk is grossly underestimated. This is a picture of the remnants of the nuclear core at 3 Mile Island. It was taken 2 years after the accident. I know the man who took these pictures, and to give you an idea of the mindset of these guys, they put a camera into the top of the nuclear reactor, and they went down to where the core was, and they didn't see anything. So they pulled the camera out, and they said, something must be wrong with the camera. So they put it in a second time, down to where the core was, and they said, something must be wrong with the camera. They pulled it back out again and recalibrated. The third time they put it down, they finally said, oh my God, we had a meltdown. So despite all the evidence of incredible radiation levels in the power plant, 2 years later, it took this picture to convince the nuclear establishment that a meltdown had really happened. It doesn't take an engineer to see that there's one unique item on this graph. That little bump in the middle there, that's the hydrogen explosion that occurred inside 3 Mile Island at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had an explosion at Chernobyl, we had one at TMI, and of course we had one, we had a bunch at Fukushima. So expecting containments to retain their integrity based on the TMI experience is wrong, based on the Chernobyl experience is wrong, and certainly based on the Fukushima experience. I argued with the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, twice in 2010, because in their assumptions, they say that, that nuclear containments do not leak. So when they're looking at siting a nuclear power plant and all of the calculations that go behind it, they say nuclear power plants do not leak. It's on the record, on the Advisory Committee of Reactor Safeguards record. They don't leak. But this picture shows just the opposite. I'm going to walk over here for a minute here. Before the pressure spike and after the pressure spike is a couple of pound difference. After the explosion, the containment never had a positive pressure again. It was never pressurized. What does that mean? It was leaking. And yet the nuclear industry will tell you that the containment retained its integrity at TMI, despite the fact that that graph exists and is well known. The tail on the right side of that pressure spike is exponential, which also shows that the pressure was leaking out of the containment. Well-known fact, but totally ignored when a power plant is licensed in anywhere in the world, that containments do leak. Of course, the picture on the right is something called the elephant's foot. It was a picture of the remnants of the core at Chernobyl, and it was taken a year after the accident by a robot. And of course, the picture on the left is the remnants of the explosion at Chernobyl as well. There's a key lesson here is that a year after Chernobyl, we had a picture of the core. 2 years after TMI, we had a picture of the core. No one has a picture of the core at Fukushima. It's so radioactive that nobody can get near it. This is what happens when you don't learn from history. This is Fukushima 2, 3, and 4, the little boxes. And this is a couple thousandths of a second in between. That flash is a hydrogen explosion that destroyed Unit 3. You know, that comment about if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And Fukushima has shown that we didn't learn the lesson from Chernobyl, and we didn't learn the lesson from TMI. This is a thermal image of Fukushima Unit 3, and this is the only geeky slide I've got today is this one. It's provided by Tokyo Electric, and that spot ties to that number. Now I'll go back over here. Yeah, what temperature does steam boil at? 100. That spot's 128 degrees. That's not steam leaking out of Fukushima. That's hot radioactive gases. And despite the fact that I've been talking about this slide for 4 years, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission continues to say that a containment will not leak. I had the same argument at Pickering when I was arguing with the Canadian regulator. And the Pickering reactors have twice as much zirconium as did Fukushima. Zirconium is the chemical element that causes hydrogen explosions. And yet they're blissfully unaware of the possibility of an explosion at Pickering. Second point, so systems will fail, whether it's cooling systems or containment systems, systems will fail. Second point is emergency planning. The Japanese were the greatest emergency planners in the world. I mean, they really expected earthquakes would come. That's what, you know, they're known for this. And yet they failed miserably at evacuating their own people after Fukushima. But we shouldn't be surprised. At Chernobyl, the Soviets didn't evacuate people soon enough either. And at TMI, we had the exact same problem, that we knew that radiation was ready to leak out, and people were not evacuated for days afterward. And the problem there is the reaction of a bureaucracy is not to protect the people, it's to protect the bureaucracy. And when you buy into the concept that nuclear is safe, it's very hard to then admit that you've been wrong and get on television and tell people to run like hell. So I gave the keynote at Penn State had a 35-year anniversary after TMI last year. And Governor Thornburgh, the former governor of Pennsylvania, was one keynote and I was the other. And I asked him afterward, I didn't want to put him on the spot in front of everybody, but I asked Governor Thornburgh, I said, you know, Governor Thornburgh, on the first day of the accident, you were lied to. And there was this 10-second pause. And he said, yeah, you're right. I was lied to. And I said, okay, knowing what you know now, that there was a meltdown, that there was a hydrogen explosion, would you have ordered an evacuation? And Thornburgh said no, which is just a fascinating insight into how a bureaucrat thinks. I said, you had one barrier left, a leaky but not failed containment. And you mean to tell me you would rather have risked the population in the river valley, Susquehanna River Valley, rather than evacuate those people? Yeah. And Thornburgh said no, even knowing how bad, if he had known how bad things were, he would not have ordered an evacuation. So why do we have emergency plans? They didn't work at TMI, they didn't work at Chernobyl, and they certainly didn't work at Fukushima. I got this email from a girl, well, she's a woman now, but she was a girl after TMI, and it's long, and I'm sorry, let me just summarize it. She was in chemistry at Middletown High School in the year of the accident, and that month they were studying radiation. They had a radiation detector hanging outside the classroom. They came into class at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the detector was inaudibly loud. It was screaming. Well, the chemistry teacher called the governor, and the governor said, we know, don't do anything about it. With that mentality and the people that we're counting on to protect us, we really can't assume that emergency planning is effective anywhere on the planet. The third point was that people will die. This is Dr. Steve Wing. If you go up on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission site, you'll find that 10 million curies of radiation were released from Fukushima and nobody died. That's the official party line of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Dr. Wing did an epidemiological study of the Susquehanna River Basin. And you see the white is the Susquehanna River. The red on either side of it is incidences where cancer rates, lung cancer rates, were twice as high as average. And the green are the surrounding hills. So what Wing was able to prove definitively is that cancer rates in the river valley were much higher than can be attributed to anything except the accident. Well, what happened to TMI? TMI happened on a calm day. There was an inversion, and all that radiation sat in the river valley. And so it ran up and down the river valley, but it didn't disperse laterally. And Wing's data is damn convincing. And yet Wing has been laughed at now for 20 years. This study was published in 1990. People did die, and there's the proof right there. Well, the same thing happens at Chernobyl. Alexei Yablokov and Nerestrenko, the Nerestrenkos, have published a book by the New York Academy of Sciences that shows that as many as 1 million people likely died. Then the nuclear industry got the editor of that fired. So after it was published, the editor was fired for publishing it. That's the kind of pressures that we're up against. And the last person is Yuri Bandashevsky. He's the guy who sort of created the concept of Chernobyl heart. Cesium is it's an analog like potassium, and it gets absorbed by your muscles. And in in fetuses and in young people, when their hearts are still growing, that cesium winds up in their heart and causes defects. Well, Bandashevsky had been studying this in lab animals and definitively showed that cesium causes heart defects in lab animals. And then he noticed that the same thing was happening in the children from the Chernobyl disaster. And the bureaucracy's response was to throw the guy in jail. So when you start throwing scientists in jail, I give you a lot of credit for actually doing this research. You know, when you start throwing researchers in jail, it has a chilling effect on other researchers. He was sentenced for 8 years, but thanks to pressure from the EU, not from America, not from the nuclear industry, but the EU, he was released after 3. When he got out, all his samples had been destroyed and all his analysis was destroyed. And he published from memory. And of course, the nuclear industry's position is, well, it doesn't count because he doesn't have any data. So you throw people in jail and then you destroy their data, and then you ignore the fact that they had data in the first place. The last point is the risk is greatly underestimated for nuclear power. We have this thing in the nuclear industry called PRA, probabilistic risk assessment, but I call it PRAE. And what the nuclear industry does is they assume they know every single way that a nuclear power plant can break, and they assign probabilities in like a tree kind of a shape. The problem is this: if you have a deck of cards, what's the chance of drawing an ace? You have 4 aces and 54 cards, so it's 1 in 13, right? We know that. So you can do a probabilistic risk assessment if you know how many cards are in the deck. And that's the problem with nuclear power. What we found is that it breaks in ways that scientists haven't counted on. So therefore, the probabilistic risk analyses are totally wrong. What I said in the speech yesterday, in the last session, the people that do these PRAs say there's a 1 in a million probability. But yet we know we've had 5 meltdowns in 35 years, about once every 7 years. So history says once in 7, the nuclear industry says 1 in a million. Which one are you going to believe? Well, I frankly believe history. And then the last point is that if you properly weigh the risks and you properly weigh the benefits for nuclear power, it's a distorted balance. The risks clearly exceed the benefits. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gundersen. A very interesting presentation, you both. And there must be some questions. So we'll start here. Okay, so it's the question is about, is there a confirmation that the start of the Chernobyl accident, there was an experiment in the safety room and they were trying to check something and then that went wrong? I believe it has been confirmed, but I will leave.
I think I can answer.
You have to be in front of the mic to be for the posterity.
Yeah, okay. I can answer that with yes. Of course, I can't go into the details, but there is no question about this, that they wanted to show something, and it was at night. And I think this was also one of the problems. Nobody was there to... Yeah, I think this is clear. You can read it everywhere now. Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe you can say more.
3 Mile Island, a lot of people would blame nuclear operators. They made mistakes on the night shift. At Chernobyl, the operators made mistakes on the night shift. So there's this tendency to blame the operator. But I was a nuclear reactor operator, and I don't think it's fair to blame the people you've put in charge of watching and control. If they need a reactor management system that's adequate to prevent these things. Essentially, when all those lights and buzzers are going off at the same time, there's way too much information for anyone to assimilate. So I can't blame the operators. And of course, Fukushima was not the operators. I've sort of dedicated the last 4 years to the brave people that stayed behind at Fukushima. They call it the Fukushima 50. In fact, there's probably 200. But 200 brave men, and I think almost all of them were men, stayed behind and fought the fires of hell. And had they not done that, Japan would have been cut in half, and the entire northern hemisphere would be significantly contaminated. So the difference between TMI and Chernobyl and Fukushima is the operators worked heroically at Fukushima. And I think they did too at TMI, but of course the authorities will blame the operator.
Merci. So we'll move to the next question. Anybody? Yes, sir? Yeah. I will have to handle the microphone right here for you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a medical oncologist, and I understand that the only cancer that has been accepted, recognized as being linked with the Chernobyl accident is thyroid cancer. Are there other cancers that are justifiably suspected as being linked to a nuclear reactor accident?
I think the incidence of cancers in this community, which I know very well, shows that you have now 30 years, 29 years latency period that any cancer, particularly now, but also lung cancer. But of course, the Russian people smoke, so at once somebody says, okay, it's just because of smoking or alcohol. And then now we also see lots of skin cancer in all places, nose and so on. And because of the bad food situation in the Soviet Union or post-Soviet states, you have also many stomach cancer and intestinal cancer. When you look and go to the Friedhof, it's the burial places, cemetery, cemetery, and you read all the people that died, you find 40, 50, 55-year-old men, and when you ask in the clinic or friends, they all die on cancer. They all die on cancer. It's really unbelievable. But, and you know, I mean, officially, we had a congress last year in Arnoldstein near Frankfurt. Officially, it is acknowledged that the incidence of cancer, but that's all over the world, is increasing. That's what they admit. But then about the diagnosis, even in Minsk and in Gomel, where I know doctors from the very beginning, Professor Malko, maybe somebody knows him, or Nesterenko, he died, but his son is in this institute, and we visited. It's really impossible to really get figures. They risk their position, they risk everything, and so they just talk, Yeah, I think science can't be done that way. Yeah, excuse me. Don't believe.
Yes. Other comments here, and then to you, please. Yeah.
Officially,
well, you will have to wait to be with the microphone.
Sorry.
Do you mind? That will be your turn.
Officially, really, it's been shown that every sort of cancer can be caused by radiation. Every cancer. But WHO only recognises thyroid cancer.
My question has to do with the genetic damage and bioaccumulation, because one of the frustrations is, of course, from exposure to something showing up the time, people lose cause and effect because it's so far distant, even though it still exists. And specifically as regards women and fertility, it has struck me, I think you used the term Chernobyl eggs, did I understand that? Because I just recently learned the term atomic eggs, that because a female is born with all of her eggs already inside of her, genetically we are the offspring of our father and our grandmother. So it is the grandmother's exposure level that directly impacts the eggs. And that is a factor in the delayed showing up. So that right now what we're seeing are the results of Chernobyl in the grandchildren and also the atmospheric testing, and of course before that Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My question is, has there been any kind of correlation of the increase in cancer rates, especially in the younger people who would be impacted by this? Has there been any epidemiological correlation of it? And if so, is there any kind of charting of an expectation of exactly where that curve is going in terms of cancer rates showing up?
Okay, so cancer rates and new generations.
The cancer rate problem I cannot really talk about, but what I can say in this county, where I know quite well about the medical situation, the doctors, the gynecologists told me that there's infertility in 30% of the couples. We in the Western world say 10%. Involuntarily, is that the word? Yeah? Involuntarily, yeah. And the abortion rate, because of genetic defects, abortion is allowed in Belarus until the day before the delivery. If you detect any problem, you can abort the child and it dies, you put him into the bucket. So this is why we don't have any official numbers. What I personally know, when Chernobyl started, I was since 1990, 4 years after the catastrophe, I know about the medical situation. We've noticed in the beginning, in the first years, a lot of breast cancer. And what happened, even when they were treated in Austria or in Germany and so on, the teachers and the nurses and the doctors who helped after the catastrophe and stayed in the zones, they all died without any remission in between. I have no friend of mine who did not die. So I suspect, and I was told later, that the cancer which is induced by radioactivity is much more apt to have metastasis and leads to death right away. Now, 30 years afterwards, we have also in Minsk a big clinic where they have mama surgery. And 2 years ago, I was told that the women are operated and they have no beds to keep them, so they go with their operated breast home and lay there and they try to survive. So the number, but these are figures you don't get, even though I know all these doctors. They say, please, leave me, don't ask, don't publish, don't do anything about it. It's really what is happening. So my message would be, we are living with Chernobyl and in the second generation. I mean, these are the young girls now.
In Russia, are they coming up? I understand in Japan why they are, the doctors, but why post-Chernobyl doctors?
But I think 20 years after Chernobyl, this was it. And they are in Belarus constructing a new reactor with Russian money. Now, because of the crisis, they can't continue, but may take it, because this is what we want. Yeah, and the population, well, it's a dictator, Lukashenko, and he has really pressure on all his population.
We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to close, unfortunately. You will be first, and you will be second. Yes. Okay. So if you can come here to have the microphone, please. And if you can identify yourself.
Yep. No worries. My name's Peter Watts. I'm from Australia. I think what the young lady here was talking about in relationship to the grandchildren, and because that's exactly the case in my case. My grandmother was exposed, and her last child, my auntie, okay, she cannot conceive now, and because my mother at the time was a young girl, and this is what I spoke of yesterday, how important you women are. Men are the problem, really. And the issue is that also that here we are talking about us humans. You just spoke of all the cancers in the gut of people and stuff. Are we also forgetting that this stuff affects vegetation, which people are eating? And I'm very aware of this. As a wool cluster, I have an eye for detail. And when I was in Japan, I walked around and I actually spotted a gum tree from Australia. So I over to the gum tree, and I'm looking at the gum tree, and I pick off one of the seeds, and I'm thinking, that doesn't look right. And then I'm thinking, maybe it's because of the cold weather or whatever. And then I looked down, I'm thinking maybe the cones on the ground from last year's seed were okay. So I'm looking on the ground, no seeds. And then I inspect this seed, gum nut seed, that I'm very, very good at identifying. It's actually a Tasmanian blue gum. And I looked at it, and that little seed pod will not produce seed again. It's actually a deformed gum seed. And this was a tree that it was exposed in the blast in August in whatever year it was, 1945. So there's long-term effects. This stuff affected my grandmother, and now I have two daughters. I'm really concerned for their, when they be able to have babies and stuff, you know, and that's where we should be looking at that third or fourth generation down the track. And I really think that it's being swept under the carpet, and it needs to be exposed for the real dangers that it is. It's not fair that here we are talking about this stuff, but that's where I think we should be focusing, and also on the animals. I mean, the wild pigs up around Fukushima now have something like 600 times the levels, and you know, then that's spreading, you know, and it's also spreading throughout the vegetation and stuff, you know. So ultimately down the track, these plants will either be altered or they will not be able to genetically reproduce, and that's all a plant really wants to do. That's all we all really want to do. That's and I think that's most important. Hey, that we look at that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony and perspective from Australia. We'll take one last question or comment. Can you come here? Yes, please.
I will try to ask my question in English. Yes, to which extent the responsibility of the government was involved with respect to the reactor state or quality that was used at that time? I mean, the reactor of Chernobyl reactor, yes. The quality, yes.
Yeah, let me touch on a couple of things that came up there. First off, the Chernobyl reactor was a dual-purpose reactor. It was actually designed not just for the power, but also for plutonium. So it was a combination of bomb. Say again? Well, actually, this was more. Yes, they all are, but Chernobyl could turn it out easier than other reactors. So there definitely was the role of the government in Chernobyl to make that type of reactor was certainly misplaced, I guess I would say. Your comment about the generation after generation, we have a woman, our board member, Chio Kaneko, comes from Japan, and she goes back every year. And this woman approached her. She has a natural garden, and she grows the plants from the seeds of the plants from the previous year. And so now we're 4 years out, and she's seeing what we call gargantuanism. You know, the plants are much, the fruits and the leaves are much larger. A cucumber will have a shoot growing out of the side of it, and that problem's been getting worse and worse from every generation. So we've asked for funds for that. There's half a dozen studies that we'd love to do, but of course the nuclear industry is not going to fund it, and so funding this kind of good science is almost impossible. And the last comment is, we've been approached at Fairewinds by more than half a dozen doctors, I can't tell you their names, in Japan, who've had their hospital privileges threatened if they continue to talk about the dangers of radiation. So, you know, it's not just Chernobyl, and it wasn't just TMI. It continues. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, has signed a letter with the Hospital Association in Japan that the Hospital Association will publish nothing without the IAEA's approval. So it goes on, you know, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we will close this workshop. Thank you to the speakers. They were very informative, and you were participating with questions. That's very important, and testimonies. So please have a good day, following day. Thank you.